I'm very enthusiastic about swifts, and I'll get a chance to ask a question about our swift box in the village and things like that later on. So I'm not going to talk about favourite birds or what summer means to me, but I've got a feeling that Peter's going to tell us all about that. So welcome Peter Williams, who's going to talk to us about the Swift project.
Thank you very much, Nick, and it's great to be here. Let's see if I can share my screen with you all. So I'm going to talk about swifts. I'm from the Leicestershire Rutland Swift Partnership, and also from two of the constituent partners within that, the Leicestershire Rutland Ornithological Society and the Leicestershire Rutland Wildlife Trust. Oops, there we go. I'm going to talk in three parts, if that's all right. Firstly, try and talk to you a bit about why I think swifts are so special. Then talk about why they're in trouble and the degree of trouble. And thirdly, what the Swift Partnership is trying to do about it. And here's a young swift in the nest contemplating its first flight. Indeed, its first flight, which will probably, if successful, last for 2 years before it lands again. Here is a swift in flight. On the face of it, you might ask, a whole talk just on one species is a bit much, isn't it? After all, we see them every year, as common as muck. Indeed, they are the 8th most numerous species in the world, something like 65 to 95 million birds across the world of our common swift. But the fact that they're close shouldn't mean, as far as I can think about it, shouldn't mean that we should dismiss them. In fact, we all, I think, ought to be just amazed about how special they are. Obviously, every bird is evolved for its own little niche to a greater or lesser extent. So if you take the robin, for example, it's a bit like a forward focus. It's a great general purpose bird. It can feed on insects or on worms, or on the bread we put out in the gardens. It can live in woodlands or in shrubs, in scrubs and all sorts of different habitats. But the swift, it's gone down an evolutionary, some people might say dead end, but you know, 8th most numerous bird in the world, can't be too much of a dead end. Has been incredibly successful at one niche, and that is flying fast and catching insects on the wing and never landing, or more or less never landing. And that sort of way of life requires it to have adapted itself. If you like, the robin was the forward focus. The swift is more like a Formula One, not very good off the Formula One track, but when it's in its element, is an absolutely superb aerial predator of insects. And firstly, I want to say a bit about their background, how they got to this sort of evolutionary niche that they're in. And to do that, it's got to say a little bit about the status, what their relationships to other birds are. So they're a part of the clade of Caprimulgiformes. Clade is a group of species, all with one common ancestor. I'll come back to that in a bit. And they're united by these features, which have short, thick humerus. So that's the, if you like, the arm. First part of the arm is relatively short but thick and very stout relatively. Very short ulna, that is the forearm in our terms. Sorry, it's the upper arm, very short secondary feathers, but a long carpus which has fused the arm and the wrist and hand, and basically in the swift's case has 10 primaries. Very narrow wings, very shallow camber, so very good at flying fast, gliding, and indeed flying very quickly, the quickest of all birds in level flight. So it's been clocked at about 65 miles an hour. There's 6 breeding species in Europe, and there's about 80,000 pairs in the UK, which unfortunately is about 53% down on 1980 levels. So that's really worrying. And here you can see a comparison between the swift on the top and the chaffinch. So this upper arm is very stout compared to, say, the chaffinch, but very short. And then the wrist and hand, which are fused to take the primaries, is very long compared to the chaffinch and other birds. And I've sort of dwelt on that a bit because I'd like just to highlight the sort of background of where swifts have come from in the evolutionary chart. So the Caprimulgiformes, the swifts, were in there about 150 million years ago. But the swifts and the hummingbirds separated from the frogmouths and the nightjars and the owlets about 50 million years ago in the Eocene. But there are still features they share in common, which I'll come back to later. The one thing you'll note from this is that the podiforms, that's the swifts, this group here, doesn't include any swallows or house martins or any birds like that. They are in a completely different family of birds. So actually the swift bears a lot in common with the hummingbirds. And if you think about the wing shape and the length of the primaries in swifts and hummingbirds, they aren't all that dissimilar. There's now over 100 swift species, and nearly all of them are resident. There's only a few of them that are migratory, but that of course includes our swift, Apis apis. The next most common is the chimney swift in North America, which only has about 15 million. So our swift is by far the most common. So as I said earlier, there's 6 mainland breeding species in Europe, and 2 of them now are residential. And we'll come on to that. So I thought I'd get a bit of audience participation in at the beginning. There are 6 other species. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to which this one is? Unfair question. I can't see any hands up, so I'll move on. There we go. It's a pallid swift, a broadly Mediterranean bird. You may well have seen them on your holidays, and your colleague in Greece may well have seen one earlier this year. They actually migrate shorter distance than our birds, and they winter north of the Sahara, so they don't actually migrate very far at all. The next one, I dare say quite a few of you have seen this one. A large, very fast swift, the Alpine swift. It's our largest swift in Europe. It tends to breed north of the pallid and winters south of the pallid. It's a feature of their migration that's coming clear now, which I'll come on to later. It has a weight almost twice as heavy as our swift. The Alpine swift goes up to around 90 grams. Our swift is incredibly light, 50 grams generally as an adult, less than 2 ounces for what is a relatively large bird. The next one, first bred in Europe in 1996. So it's a recent arrival, relatively speaking, and is the white rump swift. First, and then we also have this one. It looks very like the white rump superficially. It's actually the little swift, which now breeds in southern Spain and is resident in the areas where it breeds. And that was thought to be it. I've had to update this talk because now we have this bird as well, which has been discovered breeding in Porto in Portugal and looks to all intents and purposes like our swift, but is in fact a plain swift. And the fact that it was breeding in reasonably good numbers in Porto before it was spotted by a bird watcher does tend to indicate how hard it is to identify the plain swift against the common or the pallid swift. But it is a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and a lot more erratic in its flight, which should be a giveaway if you spend any time looking at your swifts. So that's now also resident, and it was found in December 2017, I think, in Porto. It's partly why the bird watcher spent some time looking at it. So why is the swift so special? Well, firstly, it is the fastest bird in level flight, as far as we know, clocked up to 69 miles an hour. That's not its normal feeding speed, it's more like 25 miles an hour. But even at this speed, and it will come on to links with the issue about eyesight, it can show great discernment in its prey species. It actually eats something like 400 different species of insect. But there was a beekeeper in Germany who was getting very concerned that he had a flock of swifts flying around his beehives and taking his bees. So being very protective, he decided he'd shoot some of them. He shot 8 and then dissected them and discovered that all the bees that they took were drone bees, which are actually obviously no use for making honey. So I think after that he stopped shooting them. And that's a feature that swifts share with bee eaters. You might think that with the name like bee eaters, of bee eater, that they eat a lot of bees, which they don't. They only eat about 2% of their diet as bees, and that 2% again is drones only. Their eyesight, therefore, is very good. They have bristles around their eyes to protect the eyes while they're flying so fast, very like nightjars in the same family. And the swift eye is very, has great acuity. They have what's called a double fovea, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. It's a small depression in the retina, which helps focus the eyesight, so visual acuity is at highest there. And they have 2 of these, one looking forward, as you'd expect, but also one looking to the side to detect objects that might be coming to attack them, I suppose. So it gets enhanced sideways vision. And then they have a third concealed eyelid, a nictating membrane, which is translucent, maintaining some vision, which keeps the eyes protected when they're going through dust or rain. So that's great. But the feature that most of us focus on when we're talking about swifts is the fact that they fly so much and for so long. You may have heard, if any of you are Radio 4 listeners, yesterday they were getting very excited about a report of bar-tailed godwits flying from Alaska to New Zealand non-stop for 8 days. And they're very excited this breaks the longest flight records in the world. Obviously complete rubbish, because our swifts fly for 2 years non-stop from fledging. And the first question to ask yourselves, when you see them nesting in these really small nest holes in our roofs or in our nest boxes, how can their wings possibly stand that strain when they're actually trapped in such a small nest box? We're all familiar with our own nestlings that we have with other species, or if you're watching kestrels or peregrines, how much wing flapping has to go on before a fledgling is ready to go. And for years, that nobody knew the answer to that until David Lack and other colleagues were studying the swifts in Oxford. And turns out that baby swifts do press-ups. And they do lots of press-ups to strengthen their wing muscles so that when they do set off, they've got the muscles that they need to last in long-term flight. So given that they can fly very well, they sleep on the wing. They sleep up to 10,000 feet, more normally about 5,000 to 6,000 feet. And turns out they seem to be able to sleep asymmetrically. So they're sort of napping and they even manage to get some REM sleep for up to 6 seconds at a time. According to data loggers, which people now are able to use on swifts, at least 99% of the time between breeding seasons is spent on the wing. So they've obviously cracked the secret of how you get to height and coast and sleep asymmetrically and are able to get enough sleep and rest just from doing that. It doesn't mean that when they're on the nest that they don't sleep. They do seem to sleep extremely well on the nest, but obviously that must be a sort of bonus for them. And a few other species presumably must be able to sleep on the wing. These bar-tailed godwits flying from Alaska to New Zealand obviously can. Species like albatrosses presumably can. The frigate birds have been studied quite extensively because they go on sort of fishing trips from the nest up to 5 days at a time, and they don't land on the water. And it's been discovered that they can indeed also sleep asymmetrically. But when they get back to land after just 5 days, the birds have been seen to then sleep for 12 to 13 hours at a stretch. So obviously it's tough work for them. They also feed entirely on the wing, which I think great. There must be lots of insects in the air and on the wing, which indeed there are. But when the weather turns against them, their speed in flight is a great feature for them, which means they can outrun most storms and they can do it very quickly. So if they need to, if they're feeding in Leicestershire and feeding their young, they can hop off to the North Sea or across to Wales or indeed over to Belgium and still come back and feed the young, of which more in a bit. They also breed on the wing as well, although they'll also mate in nest boxes and nest sites. Right, and then the breeding, as you know, they're only with us for 3 months of the year, which is an incredibly short time. They are loyal to their partners. Once they've mated, although they don't spend the winter months with their partner, they do seem to re-establish the pair bond very quickly, and normally have between 2 and 4 young. The average is about 2.1, and what seems to be the key feature of success in any one year seems to be the weather in June is the key feature in having success. Now, the feature of torpor in young is extremely important for swifts. If bad weather does arrive and the parent birds have to travel off away from the breeding site to feed, then the young aren't going to get fed for quite considerable times. Now, most bird species, that would be fatal. If you know, the young blackbird not being fed for more than a couple of hours, that would be curtains for them. But the young are able to go into this state of torpor, and it links, if you like, back to that family tree I was showing you. Some of the birds there also share that feature, some of the hummingbirds, but in particular the whip-poor-will, it's a sort of nightjar in North America, that is able to actually go into hibernation only in the northern end of the range in Mexico, where they get cold winters. There seems to be enough advantage to the birds being on site early in the season that going into hibernation is a tactic or strategy that is successful for them. So they will go into hibernation when the weather turns against them. It's not a feature of many birds. Torpor is shared by a few species in this particular family, but not many. I'll just show you a picture of the whip-poor-will. Okay, there we go. So very, very similar to our nightjar there. Now this feature of torpor, there's a few grisly bits here. Scientists seem to love experimenting with birds, don't they? A scientist in France decided he'd take a young nestling, well, actually quite mature nestling from the nest in France at 57 grams, which is about as much as they ever get. So that's a whole 2 ounces. And he observed it dying, which is, you know, really nice. And it took 21 days for that swift nestling to die. It's absolutely astonishing. Similarly, at 10 days in Switzerland, a nestling which had been reared with good weather in June weighed 50 grams. At 10 days in Oxford, a nestling following a period of poor weather weighed just 5 grams, but it was still alive and prepared to recover and grow again, which is absolutely astonishing. Similarly, in Oxford, where they have a policy of not interfering with the birds, the nestling that was abandoned by its parents at hatching didn't die for 48 hours. So this period of torpor and its ability to switch off and then start growing again is extremely useful for it, but it does mean that the nestling period can vary quite considerably from about 5 weeks to 8 weeks. Songbirds generally will only vary by a few days, and they will be much less than that. So a blackbird will leave the nest after about 2 or 3 weeks, but they continue to be fed after leaving the nest, whereas swifts are entirely independent as soon as they leave the nest. So they're feeding themselves and are off on their own. Just a couple of other cruel scientists. A chap called Koskinis took young and adults from a nest and recorded their temperature as they starved to death. After a few days, the young lost control of their body temperatures at night, but they still regained normal temperatures the following day. So torpidity, if you like, at night doesn't matter when they're not being fed, but they still need to be able to feed and be active during the day. And then they travel huge distances. So the migration down to South Africa, which is where they spend the winter, or our birds do, is at least 6,000 miles. If one lives for 20 years, and swifts have been recorded living that long, amazing for a small bird, yeah, for less than 2 ounces, then they'll fly around 1.6 million miles, which is about 7 times the distance to the moon, which people seem to like that distance. The swifts also have a unique form of grasping toes. So you'll be familiar with most birds, or many birds, two toes forward and 2 toes back, and they grasp. I don't know how to bar, I do. So they grasp a branch like that. But swifts don't do that. They go that way to grasp. So they're able to grasp vertical faces quite strongly and grip whilst they're hanging off a vertical surface, which is, you know, what they need for their lifestyle. They don't want to be perching at all. Actually, the grip is quite strong, and as you know, apus apus, well, I didn't know this. Aristotle named them, and he called them no-toes, which is where they get the name apus apus from. He was completely wrong, of course. They do use their toes. They use them particularly on migration, and in bad weather, if they're in an unfamiliar area, they'll land on building surfaces or tree trunks, whereas when this sort of horizontal gripping really holds them in good stead. Which is great for them, but still in bad weather can be a real challenge for them. Last year, you may have seen some photos of chimneys of swifts gripping together in a great mass, great sort of stalactite of swifts held up in Italy by really bad weather. And that's a good way of surviving the nights, although in that case, quite a few, particularly on the outside of the huddle, died. The head design is also very interesting. Obviously the swift, it's only 2 ounces, clearly hasn't got any weight in its bones. Here's the head, and you can see the size of the head socket. And you can also see how translucent the rest of the skull is. And indeed, there's some random holes there. Now, clearly, that is really great for keeping the weight to a minimum so that they can manage their lifestyle. It's also been speculated that that's really good for being able to take shocks from when they move direction very suddenly, as they do to follow insects. And that's a feature that's in common with other birds similar, which also take shocks. So things like terns and kingfishers also have that feature. They're also very long-lived birds for something very so small. The average age is 8. And they don't actually breed till they're 3 or 4. So they need to live that long if they're only going to live only breed 3 or 4 years on average. And it's been found that poor weather in July leads to lower survival of adults into the following year. So they are very much on the edge of success, these birds, all the time. Particularly our birds, the further north you go, the shorter the summer, the fewer the insects, the time pressure is really against them. And we'll come on to it. Well, it's been found, one of the recent things, no, I'll come on to that in a bit, sorry, with this slide here. So our birds migrate to Africa. This is now quite a famous map. This is a bird that was tagged in Falmere and was able to be observed across the whole of its migration to Africa and back. And this seems to be quite typical for birds that are fairly far north in Europe. There's a sort of leapfrog migration. So our birds, generally speaking, go down the west coast of Africa, then across, and spend the winter wandering around between the Congo and across to Madagascar on the savannah and the forest, that area, filling up for the winter before they come back, and then they go across the Gulf of Guinea, is it, to Liberia, where they then spend at least a week fueling up. There seems to be a sea current off that part of Africa at that time of year, which is fairly predictable and tends to bring good quality rains into Liberia, and therefore produces lots and lots of insects. So they wait for that period, feed up, and then will fly back very, very quickly from there back to their nesting sites in England. We recently discovered that birds that breed down in Italy, Switzerland, Spain, actually leapfrog them and migrate all the way to South Africa, where it appears that the feeding is an awful lot better. And they get back to Switzerland, France and Italy earlier than our birds, and they tend to have higher breeding success rate. But for a bird that breeds in something like 120 countries, I suppose you expect a sort of evolutionary approach, which is always going to be testing the boundaries of where is viable for them. So that's a little bit about swifts and why they're so special, and if you like, the Formula One equivalent of the bird world. But I did mention that swift numbers are in some trouble, and this 53% decline in the last 15 to 20 years. So obviously we're worried about what's causing that. So the first thing to do sometimes is to look at what's been happening to the birds, how are predators affecting them. And here is a hobby, which, as you know, is able to catch swifts and will eat them. But they've always done that, and there's no indication that they're getting any better at it. So generally speaking, the rule, of course, is that the prey controls the number of the predators, not the other way round. So it's not considered that, or indeed sparrowhawks or other birds are a particular problem. They do have their own lousefly, and the people who deal with ringing of swifts on a regular basis, they get used to having also the company of the swift lousefly. But a number of adults, when they've been caught for ringing purposes, have often been found with louseflies on them. They don't seem to cause a parasitic load that is terminal for the swift. After all, this parasite doesn't want to kill its host. It's got to live on it for a year until it comes back again, or for at least most of the year. The larvae are left in the nest box until the swifts return, and then they hatch and jump on board again for the summer. So again, it's not thought that that is a big problem. Right. So the most popular, well, one of the most popular issues that certainly the partnership focuses on is the loss of breeding sites in existing buildings. As you know, sometime in the last 50 million years ago, when humans started getting a bit more popular, swifts swapped from nesting in tree cavities and cliff cavities and shifted into our homes. They found much more useful. But more recently, we have started closing the natural gaps that we used to have that swifts were able to use. So we've been closing fascias and soffit boards and making it much harder for swifts to find nest sites. And swifts are very, very loyal to their homes or their nests. And you'll find on a site where the opening has been closed while they've been away, that the birds will come back and they'll fly straight at where the hole was, ignoring the fact that it's been closed. So you'll hear quite a bit of banging in those instances. And it takes them a while before they will go off and try and find another site. So we as a partnership have focused quite a lot on trying to get A, stop people filling in holes, but B, to provide nest boxes on existing homes and on new builds. And part of what we do is to try and encourage builders and planning authorities to do that. The other issues that are affecting birds generally are the issue about loss of insects. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the statistics. I mean, the most telling one, I think, is the experiment conducted in Germany, where they've been measuring insect biomass now for 27 years in nature protection areas, 63 of them. And the insect biomass over that period has fallen by 76%. And we're all also, I'm sure, familiar with driving our cars and not having them insect splattered like they used to be. So that's a real problem. And clearly, in part, it's been caused by agricultural change, the amount of spraying of herbicides, and pesticides and insecticides that's going on. Even according to DEFRA, farmers in the UK sprayed on average 17.5 applications of pesticide to each hectare of arable land in 2015. Clearly, insects are going to struggle with that sort of load, and it affects the biomass generally. And clearly, we can focus on nest boxes as much as we like if there's no insects for these birds to eat. And indeed, if the insects themselves are carrying this weight of herbicides or insecticides, you do wonder what effect that has on the swift itself. And finally, of course, there's the big issue of climate change. Birds are having to change their migration routes and timetables to allow for the fact that the weather is changing. But if the swift is so reliant on the Liberian rainfalls, they're going to hold up in Liberia until that rainfall and those insects come. And then we may well find by the time they get back to this country, similarly to the cuckoos, that they're missing quite a bit of the early burst of insect load that they would otherwise have been dependent on. So you know, climate change again is a bit of a problem. So the third part of the talk, partnership, what are we doing? Just before I leave that, sorry, this latest research is quite interesting in terms of migration patterns of the swift. So I mentioned this leapfrog pattern, which you get in most populations. What they found in swifts is that the southern breeding populations in Europe migrate to wintering areas further south in Africa, while the northern populations winter to the north. And as a result, the southern populations raised more young and arrived and left a month earlier than the northern populations. So I don't think they bother with Liberia, and that's probably just a feature of our birds and more northern European birds, which need a bigger feed up because they're traveling further north into Europe. So the partnership. The Leicestershire Rutland Partnership, the Swift Partnership, is made up of the Wildlife Trust, the Ornithological Society, the County Council, City, the National Forest Company, Charnwood, and many individuals and local groups. And we're all united in love of swifts and getting really worried about the loss of the numbers. So what do? We run a number of initiatives. So we've held, particularly pre-pandemic, a number of events for developers and planners where we try to persuade them about, for example, the planners are insisting on installation of swift boxes or indeed swift bricks. I've got a visual aid here. Here's a swift brick. You can see by my straining that they're not light things. This one's made by Ibstock Brick, unfortunately not in Leicestershire, but one of their other factories. And they can be installed very successfully in new buildings. They can do that with swifts, whereas you can't really with lots of other species, because swift is in fact incredibly clean and tidy, and you don't get a build-up of nesting material and other rubbish in the nest box. We also produce lots of, a number of leaflets for developers and planners and house owners who find they've got swifts. So this is an advice leaflet on swift bricks, and here's one that is aimed at house owners. We run events, usually called Swift Halves because they're always in pubs, and they consist of a meet-up in a pub, a quick talk about why swifts are important, why they're in trouble, and then a walk around an area to get people used to swift behaviour. It is surprising how many people don't actually know they've got swifts nesting in their houses, and indeed can't identify a swift, and have never seen a swift go into a nest site. I mean, it isn't easy to find, but at the right time of year, in June, you can usually find a nest or two. I'll just go back my list. I haven't updated this. There's a Swift Week, Awareness Week every year in June. I haven't put the date in for 2022, so sorry about that. And we also run an amount of monitoring of swifts. So we get lists from the planning authorities of sites where they have put a condition on for the installation of swift nests. And we have been asked in the past, would it make sense for them to require the builders to monitor the success or otherwise of their swift nests? And we've told them not to bother because it's the nature of swifts. They don't come back to the nest very often. You could be spending a lot of money on expensive ecologists watching the sides of buildings and not seeing any swifts for hours and hours and hours. So LROS has set itself up to try to do some monitoring of the sites that the planning authorities have told us that they've asked for them on. So if you like, we're monitoring the presence of the bricks that's actually been successful in being installed, and then also monitoring the success of the bricks in terms of nesting success. We've also done some Swift brick fitting ourselves and some Swift box fitting. We raise awareness wherever we can. It's an area we're looking for to do more. We'd like to find a parish in the county that would like to become a Swift parish, where we have seen elsewhere in the country. You might be familiar with the amount in Oxford. Lewis in Sussex does similar. Harleston in Norfolk. They have flags that they put out when the Swifts get back. The children at the school know where all the Swift boxes are. They have a Swift Day every year and they celebrate their Swifts returning. And it's very similar to what happens elsewhere in the world. Swifts nest in the Forbidden City in Beijing, and there's a huge sort of welcoming ceremony when they get back there every year. And elsewhere in the world, you know, people do really get concerned about their Swifts. And we also work quite closely with planners, not only in monitoring boxes, but also in letting the Environmental Record Centre know where swifts are nesting. What they then do with that data each year is to establish a 250-metre zone around nesting sites, where if they get an application for development within that area, they will then say, well, these are close enough to existing colonies of swifts. We will seek a Swift brick or Swift boxes to be installed, because we know they've got a fair chance of finding those boxes. Whereas if you're outside and away from existing colonies, the chances are very much less. We're not on our own in terms of being interested in swifts. By far the best site for swifts, if you're interested in pursuing an interest, is the one run by Ed Mayer, who's absolutely fantastic on swifts. He runs Swift Conservation, gives talks all around the country, tries to develop. He seems to have some architectural background, so he can advise people on how to accommodate swifts under tiles, under eaves, in thatch roofs and so on. He has a number of leaflets about the nest box sizes and dimensions, where to put them, how high to put them, and so on. And there is a fund of information. There is also an app, a Swift Mapper app, which I recommend. You load it onto your smartphone. When you see a nesting swift, it's a very quick process to then highlight where it is and send off the record to the Swift Mapper app. It's run by the RSPB, but the Environmental Record Centre in Leicestershire gets the records back each year. So it's a very quick and easy way of keeping records of the success of nesting swifts. You can also record screaming parties of swifts. Not quite as useful information as seeing birds going into nests, but still useful in tracking down where we can follow up from the LROS and try and track down from screaming records where birds are actually nesting. The BTO have got quite a bit of information on swifts, particularly tracking studies. The map I showed you of the bird going to Africa and back was produced by a BTO ringed and with a tracker applied to it by the BTO. And finally, the RSPB also do a lot on swifts, not only the mapper but lots of information. And of course, they'll always sell you a nest box as well. So here's 3 Swift nest bricks installed in this building, which happens to be in Anstey. There's 1, 2, 3, and here's some Swifts prospecting, and they all decided to go into the same nest hole together. That's sort of nesting behaviour that's quite typical. Here's 2 intrepid members of the Swift Partnership. You might recognise Russell Parry there. We installed these 10 Swift bricks at Conkers, and the management there play the Swift calls religiously every year in May and June, and so far without success. Unfortunately, we think we're too far away from existing colonies. It's got a nice height, lots of good, clear approach to them, so we are still hopeful that we'll be successful there. This is a member of the partnership in Hobie Church Tower, Gary Barker. He's installed 7 boxes there, one with a camera included. Swifts do use the church, but they haven't yet come through the louvres and started using his Swift boxes. Typically, Swifts do take a few years to find Swift boxes, but people all over the world are keen, as I was saying earlier. Here we are in Baku in Azerbaijan, and if you look on the side of this building, you'll see those 3 huge Swifts. That's them in a bit more detail. If this was a face-to-face meeting, I'd have brought a prize to the person who guesses how many Swift boxes there are there. But in the absence of being able to give you a prize, I'll just tell you that's 502 Swift boxes there, some with cameras added, I think, which is just amazing. A wonderful sort of cultural sort of experience and work of art. That's a picture from Ed Mayer. Other places are experimenting with Swift towers. This is an artist's impression of one that has now been put up in Cardiff. So each of these little pixels in here is a nest box, and the same on the other side. They are incredibly expensive. They are works of art, some of them. There's a fabulous one in Cambridge, which looks like a setting sun, huge sort of disc. As yet, I don't think there's many Swifts used either of them. And for the cost, you could actually put in an awful lot of Swift bricks and Swift boxes. Which brings me back, just about within the hour, to our youngster about to set sail on this amazing journey that's got ahead of it. This was a picture taken by 2 of our volunteer data collectors, Martin Randall and Karen Headley, of the nest. They've got a nest box on their own home as well. And here we have the young Swift getting ready for its journey. And I'd just like to finish, if I may, with a little quote from a book that's come out this year from Sarah Gibson, Swifts and Us, just talking about her emotional experience of following Swifts through the year. And this is at the point when they've gone and how she feels about it. And what she says is, "But I also love that they go, that their lives are lived elsewhere for 9 months of the year, without a shred of dependence on humankind, roaming over rainforest and savanna, always in the air. For 90 days, Northern Europe's lengthy daylight hours and relative abundance of nesting holes have been useful to them, as they have for thousands of years. Then, 2 or 3 young raised and job done, they return to a totally aerial existence. It is their otherness that makes them so fascinating. They touch our lives briefly and then vanish. This is part of their magic." So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Peter. I guess you'll be happy to take questions now.
Very happy, yes.
Nick and Prue, I think you've got a question. So do you want to go first then?
Yes, please. Peter, we live in New Bolverden, and
Yep.
the swifts used to nest in the church under the spire. It's a shingle spire, a Sussex spire. But unfortunately, the shingles were all replaced in the summer, and the scaffolding boards prevented the swifts from entering the building. But they also nested around the church hall in quite good numbers, and some of the houses there. And to try and compensate for what happened at the church, David Penton, who's present, he made a fabulous nest box for us out of wood, and we've mounted it up high on the church hall, facing northwards, and we painted it so that it looks like bricks, and most people don't notice it. And the swifts continued to use the building, and I'm not sure that they were there last summer, or possibly the summer before even. But they do fly around in the evenings late in their season, screaming, about 7 or 8 of them.
Yep.
Some of them must have been born in that building. Is there a good chance that those ones could take up the nest box?
Yes, there is a chance. Typically what happens, the youngsters, when they go to Africa, they tend to stay there for their first year, so they don't come back until they're 2, and they won't breed in that year. They'll be nest prospecting and just getting used to the area where they fledged and working out where the nest boxes are. If you read David Lack's book, he talks about sort of nest banging that goes on from young birds, prospecting where the opportunities are for empty nest boxes, where they may be able to come back and nest in their 3rd or 4th year. So the birds, that fledged last year or the year before, you wouldn't expect to be back and nesting yet at the church. So there's a chance they'll be back, and if they can't find anywhere else, then there's a chance they'll use your nest box. If you want to improve the odds, you can play a tape of screaming swifts. Morning and evening seems to be the best times for that. You don't have to play it all day. And you can download the tape from Ed Mayer's Swift Conservation site. It's a fairly short one. It's obviously quite loud, but people tend not to notice swifts calling that much. This is a natural sound of summer. So shouldn't annoy your neighbours too much. Yeah, but if you can get strictly speaking, of course, the church were breaking the law by preventing access to a nesting site.
Yeah. There was an ecologist, and they were interested in the bats.
Yeah. And
they seemed to completely ignore the fact, or didn't ask about swifts.
Right.
It's rather sad.
Very sad, yes. Sad. Ecologists worth the name should have been interested in the swifts as well. Yeah. But if you can do anything with the diocese in terms of putting nest boxes in the tower, or what have they replaced the shingles with?
No, new shingles.
New shingles, right. Well, it might be worth asking Ed Mayer, if you take a picture of the new shingles, whether he could suggest a way around that to let the birds back in. He's very opportunistic and very practical guy. He'd probably find an answer to that.
Right, thank you.
Good.
Anybody else have a question they want? Oh, Andy and Sam, I think you seem to be next.
And David Crimson.
Yeah. Okay.
I've always been interested in the way that swifts always seem to fly ahead of the rain, and they're quite good forecasters of really heavy rain. This year alone, we had about 100 come over, followed by the biggest rainstorm I've ever seen, which just managed to miss me. I just wondered what the reason is, if you know the reason, why that happens so much.
Well, they can't feed successfully within rainstorms, or not that much, because the insects will be put down to ground by the rain. So they tend to surf the rainstorms, get out of the way of them, and go and feed where they can ahead of the rainstorm. But they'll also be using, around a rainstorm, you get these wonderful winds, don't you, in advance. So they'll be using the winds when they hit a woodland strip, say, or a large building. That tends to concentrate flying insects. So they will use that opportunity to feed on the insects as they're being concentrated by the breeze and the wind and the buildings. But then they will fly a long, long way away if they're worried about the scale of the storm. If it's a sort of summer thunderstorm, that doesn't involve a great big movement. But if you get a large low pressure over England going southwest to northeast, they will tend to fly quite considerable, hundreds of miles to avoid the worst of that to feed. So typically, for example, birds in Leicester will go out to Rutland Water and feed low over Rutland Water to feed, and then come back. Even when it's wet, insects will still be hatching off the reservoirs.
Brilliant, thank you. That's excellent, thank you.
Peter, did you say somebody else was waiting to ask a question?
David Goodsall was looking interested. You got a question, David?
David? David, would you like to unmute yourself and ask? Yeah, thank you.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you are.
Our village, in common with lots of other places, is having a lot of development. And you talked about planning authorities imposing conditions on builders to incorporate swift boxes. And I'm just wondering what sort of arguments and conditions are used by planning authorities when they do that.
Right. The National Planning Policy Guidance, which all planning authorities have to follow, has recently been strengthened to go from no net loss of biodiversity to net gain of biodiversity from any development. Now, obviously, that's extremely difficult to measure, and the DEFRA at the moment are going through a process of trying to establish a method of measuring, or a method by which you can measure biodiversity gain in advance before you've actually done the work. Now, one of the easiest things for builders to do is things attached to buildings, because there's going to be buildings involved in any development. So things like swift bricks, swift boxes, house martin nests, bat boxes, hedgehog gates, all those things are quite simple, and hopefully planning authorities will be looking for more than that to get from builders. But as a minimum, most planning authorities now can stipulate these things as a matter of course. And indeed, within the planning policy guidance, nest boxes for swifts are specifically mentioned now. So it's a big step forward. Actually getting planning authorities to follow up and require impose the condition and to get the builder to do it takes a bit more work. But that is the opportunity. One of the difficulties for us, of course, is we're saying that the best place for swift boxes is where swifts already breed. Now, if you've got a large out-of-town development, you're not going to have existing nesting swifts anywhere near there. So it's quite difficult to say, well, there's good grounds for imposing that condition in those circumstances. Because generally speaking, as you know, swifts are mostly in Victorian buildings, and Victorian factories and the like, where there are lots of good nesting opportunities. But if the development's large enough, I would have thought the opportunity shouldn't be missed.
Yeah,
there's lots of good arguments for the planners now.
I'm just thinking what arguments you could use to persuade developers to put in swift boxes, because obviously it's expense for them, and you have to have some pretty good evidence, I would have thought, to persuade them.
Well, the evidence is the tricky bit, but the National Planning Policy Guidance is a very key element and document that planners have to work to now, and they need to be able to demonstrate they're getting biodiversity gain out of developments. So the negotiations with builders, I would have thought now, there's much more chance of getting it than there was even a year ago.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
So
Thanks.
good luck.
I think that's helpful. Thank you.
And certainly, if you're doing a development anywhere close to existing, there's no argument anymore. It's a cert. You ought to be able to get it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I might say that I'm having trouble, or I was having trouble before the pandemic, getting to talk to Hinckley and Bosworth planners, but we are trying again now.
Right. Yes. Do they have anybody specifically involved with biodiversity gain and?
Not that I'm aware of. The last I heard, the only planning authorities that have got biodiversity officers are Charnwood, the city, and the county.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
But all the districts do take advice from the County Environmental Records Centre, and they all get these search maps for biodiversity of the county, and so they know where there are features of interest, whether it's nesting swifts or it's a local wildlife site or an SSSI or whatever. So they do have information.
Right. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question, folks, for Peter? I can't see anybody, so can I nip in with a question while we're here? It's two questions really, but both very, very closely related. You've obviously mentioned that to put up swift boxes is most effective if you're near to a current roost or colony. So I was just wondering what sort of percentage of boxes near to a colony are taken up? And similarly to that, if we were to put a box up somewhere that was distant from a colony, is there a chance of it being taken up, or is it really more decoration than any hope of actually attracting swifts? And do you need many of them to make a colony rather than a lone box? So there's three questions there, isn't it?
They're all good questions. Swifts are sort of loose colonial nesters, but they do seem to like being reasonably close to each other, if not in each other's pockets. The tower in Oxford that David Lack studied for years and years, I don't know if they've ever had more than 40% of the nest boxes occupied at any one time, even at its best. And it has gone down low, and it is very dependent on the weather. So you wouldn't expect all your nest boxes on a building to be ever occupied at the same time, although different boxes might be occupied at different times. But clearly the birds are fussy. They want to make sure they're in the right location. The youngsters aren't going to get too hot. They're not going to get too cold or too wet, and the wind isn't going to get them particularly badly, which is why I worry about those swift towers, that they're going to get far too hot and the nestlings are going to get baked in there. So that photo of the building in Anstey where you've got 3 swift bricks, I think that's a good standard. If you could get 3 on buildings together like that, that would be best. And particularly in that example there, they've got, I think it's about 5 blocks of townhouses. And I think on 6 of the gable ends, you've got swift boxes. So it's about 18 boxes, quite loose colony now, but it is being successful, and it is right in the heart of the village. So it's close to the traditional nesting spots for swifts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
And they might still be used by other birds. Sparrows and starlings and blue tits are known to use them. You can get, there's I forgot the name of the company, there's a German company does swift boxes in something called woodcrete, and they have a little baffle on that stops starlings getting into them. They can't bend low enough to get in, whereas the Swift sort of slides in. If you don't want starlings, but there again, starlings are in trouble. They could do
Oh, yeah.
nest boxes as well.
Almost happy to have anything nowadays.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody
Right,
else?
yes, please.
Oh, yes. Hello, Angie.
Yeah, I just wondered what you determine as close by. It's just that I have a new development going ahead by me, and I thought, oh, should I tackle Hingley and Bosworth Council? But you say they're Swifts in Newbold. Is that too far away? Because I haven't seen, many here at all.
Oh yeah, we're only talking, 50, 100 metres.
Really?
This 250 metre zone was so they could, with justification and evidence, say, well, that is an appropriate distance to have Swift boxes. If you're in Market Bosworth, there ought to be Swifts there, I'd have thought.
Yes, I haven't seen any particularly around where I am, so
right.
there could be in other areas.
You'd expect them to be in the village centre around the market square and the old school, places like that, I would have thought. Yeah.
So would it be worth me contacting Hinkley and Bosworth to see if they could do anything on this new development?
How far away is that development from the centre?
Oh, it's not very far. It's a few minutes away from the centre.
Yeah.
Opposite the high school, more or less, just across.
Oh, right. Oh, well, worth trying. Have they already got permission?
Pardon?
Has the development already got planning permission?
Yes, they're actually building.
Oh, right. It's probably too late to go.
Is it too late now?
Not too late to speak to the builders.
Yeah, they've still got 3 bungalows to start. They're starting those very shortly.
Yeah.
So it might be worth a try.
Certainly, yeah. People will say you really need to be, 8 metres or more in height. But there isn't a hard and fast rule. There's a pair apparently that nest in a monastery in Ireland every year, 42 inches from the ground, and they're successful. So a bungalow, if they're in the apex of the bungalow roof, they should be all right there. The key is to find sites which have a free and open approach to the nest site, so you haven't got windows in the way of the flight in, and there's not trees planted in front of it which are going to get in the way.
Oh, I see.
They do fly fast and straight, and when they go into the nest box, there's no hesitation. They just crash into it, generally speaking, and use the impetus to get into the nest box without much subtlety.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Pete, for a really interesting talk. I've been fascinated by these amazing birds before the talk, but I think the incredible facts that you've given about their anatomy, their lifespan, their abilities astonish me even more. And I'm particularly left wondering how they managed to pick out those stingless male honeybees at such speed, and also how the person who owned the bees managed to shoot 1, let alone 8. I imagine there must have been a lot of holes in beehives. I'm particularly grateful for the excellent spotters guide, as I think my Swift ID was proved a little bit wanting on that. And I think it's really sad that such an iconic British bird is doing so badly. And I think you've helped us to understand just how much we can do for them by redesigning our architecture and trying to shape a world for them that's going to make it easier for them to survive and to prosper a little bit more. So I'm very grateful to you and the people who are doing the same things as you for doing so much to conserve it. So thanks again. Really good talk. Really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. More power to your elbow in trying to do something. Thank you.